can hear myself, you can hear me okay? Good, good. Right, welcome to this presentation. I promise you're the right one. You'll see how it all fits in a second. So welcome to Tracy Island 2 Electric Boogaloo. And what we'll do is through the medium of cult references, I will talk about fire safety information, the golden thread, and how it can relate. I promise it'll make sense. A quick introduction to start with. So I'm Dan Rossiter. I work for the British Standards Institution. Hopefully you've all heard of BSI before. We're the ones who make those horrible, very expensive standards everyone has to buy. But as part of that, what we try and do is instill good practice into the industry. I myself have an architectural background. I'm now mainly focused on our digital standards and the way we do digital construction. And what's happening very interestingly at the moment is that digital is starting to kind of converge with other areas where we're doing digital with sustainability and we're doing digital with things like fire safety. And that's sort of where this presentation leans into, with some of our standards that are starting to merge those worlds together, which is quite interesting. So if you bear with me, I'm going to set a bit of a premise first. Quick show of hands, who here's watched Thunderbirds before? Good, you'll get where I'm going with this, so it's fine. So, after several unsuccessful attempts to thwart international rescue, the Hood has come up with an ingenious plan. He's going to do something different this time. He's going to purposely fail, and when he does, he's going to hypnotize one of the unsuspecting civilians. Oh, my animation works and everything. And he's going to hypnotize them to drop a explosive device on Thunderbird 2. It looks very innocuous, and the idea was that he'll set it, there'll be a timer set on it, and it'll be sent back into storage on Tracy Island, and then he can actually cause it to explode there. So that's his plan. And he manages to successfully hypnotize the person. They go, and it means that as you get back to Tracy Island, you'll notice that the explosive is about here-ish. So, the plan has been set. Virgil did what he does normally. He finished, he gave Thunderbird 2 a good clean, he took everything out, did the maintenance, moved everything out. So, the plan has been set. Whilst on a fairly innocent drive, Lady Penelope's talking to Parker and talking about how Virgil seemed strangely tired, especially after he moved a very large box out of Thunderbird 2, commenting how he didn't expect it to be there. Parker, immediately suspicious, says, right, well, I need to look into this, so I need to first find out where everything is. So he sets himself a little mission. First, he needs to get access to the as-built information or the record keeping that Tracy Island has for itself. Hopefully simple enough. From there, access the as-built drawings and as-built information to look for where the hangar is. From there, locate exactly where it's placed to go investigate the package and work out if there's anything untoward happening. So, taking this step by step, try again, accessing the records. Now, thankfully, when Tracy Island was built a while ago, what they tried to do is instill this thing called the golden thread. The idea being that when you look back at some of the documentation that's come out the last couple of years, such as Building a Safer Future, also known as the Hackett Review, it talked about some of the failings following things like the Grenfell tragedy, and it spoke about the need for a golden thread of good quality information. The idea being that as people need to assess and manage both the fire and structural safety of a building, there should be clear and unambiguous records of that information put in place. And this idea of, to better manage it, there needs to be that digital record. Now, going further, people like the Building Regulation Advisory Committee started to think about and define what the golden thread is. And in particular, it talked about this idea that the golden thread would be responsible, will help support those responsible for the building, and it'll do things like show how the building was compliant when it went for building regulations. So as such, then it will hold things like relevant certificates, it will hold information, it will hold things like as-built information. The idea that it'll also show evidence of meeting the new requirements. I don't know about you, but I probably consider Tracy Island to be a higher risk set of buildings, so I imagine it would probably go through that gateway process, although I'm not sure which local authority they deal with, but we'll worry about that another time. And then ultimately, at the same time, it needs to be able to identify, understand, manage, and mitigate building risks. So it needs to hold things like the safety case report, risk assessments, method statements, and other bits and pieces as well. So it's this store of relevant information relating to both fire and structural safety. And as part of that, it's meant to cover both the information and the process itself. So weirdly, you need to use a golden thread to have a golden thread, which is a bit of an odd kind of phraseology, but they have to have the checks and balances in place to make sure that it's accurate, up to date, and is maintained as a persistent set of information to support what's happening. Now, there are some good practices out there to help. One in particular is the British Standard BES 8644 Part 1, which delves into this idea of how you manage fire safety information in a digital form. And it has a number of recommendations within it. It talks about how you need to understand your own tasks and relevant to your own function. So be you a lead designer, be you a fire engineer, be you the lead contractor or something like that, and how you interface with other people. And clause 4 in the standard goes through in quite detail in what project stages some sort of activity should take place, such as liaising with the fire engineer, looking at the initial floor plans, those sorts of things. It also talks about this standardized approach to exchanging fire information, which it calls fire information exchange. So the idea is that there's almost like a structured way of taking that information from the designers and the constructors and giving it to the asset owner, the fire engineer, emergency services, building users, and those sorts of mechanisms. So effectively a standardized suitcase to shift this information across. And it also recommends conformance to the 19650 series. Now, a quick show of hands, if I say BIM, have you heard, everyone knows what I'm on about? Yes, a mix of hands, nods, good. 19650 are just the standards around BIM, which talks about good information management, because we're talking about managing fire information more specifically. So it all ties together. And interestingly, it talks about the need to deliver using something called a common data environment. And we'll talk about that just for a second, then I'll promise we'll get back to the Thunderbirds. So the idea behind the common data environment is that it's a electronic document management system, an EDMS, with extra processes overlaid on top of it. It's not enough to just have a Dropbox or something like that. It needs to be more robust with these extra processes put in. For example, this idea of a space for creation where people sort of create content that others shouldn't see. You might have started to develop the design of the building, but it's not yet ready to show the structural engineer, fire engineer, or other professionals. That is very much known as the work in progress space. It is private to those individuals, and it isn't actually accessible by anyone else. The idea then, it goes through a review gateway. Around this point up here, I didn't want to risk the laser pointer in case it goes somewhere else. But as part of that, there's a shared space. The idea then isn't that shared space, it's where the project team has access to that information. So other designers, engineers, contractors can then see it because you've now approved it for sharing. You can say, right, it's now ready for others to interface with, ready for others to use. Later on in the project, it then becomes more substantiated. It might be at the end of a work stage. It might be going out for planning, for Gateway 1, building control, those sorts of mechanisms. At that point, it becomes published. And that's the mechanism where you want others outside of the team to be able to see it, either accessing the document management system itself or providing local copies, perhaps in like some sort of premises information box or something like that, or through this digital mechanism therein. And obviously through time, documents and drawings get updated, they get changed, they get revised, so there needs to be a way to archive and record a record of what those things were. Because maintaining things like the design intent is quite important to understand why those decisions were made earlier on as well. And there are some various standards to support those. So there's some good standards around document management on how these things work that you can overlay. I mentioned the 19650, the BIM standards, and 8644. They all work in tandem together to kind of iterate this approach of how you manage these documents properly. So in theory, if Tracy Island has done this right, it should be very easy for Parker to be able to go in, access this published information, and find the exact information he needs. Sure enough, he logs onto their document management system, he starts to have a look at it, and he realizes, hang on, I've first got to try to work out what information I'm going to look for. Because of course, there are many different ways that you can hold information. The first is you could hold it as structured information, and this is what we've talked about a little, this idea of there could be a database, there could be building logbooks, there could be kind of data sheets, there could be, this highly structured information, but that's not all we keep. We also keep kind of less structured things as well, and how do we ensure we can look after those? So, I mean, judging by the audience here, did anyone have a mini disc player when they were growing up? I see a few smiles. Can you play any mini discs now? No, you don't have the tools able to play them. Does anyone have a computer with a floppy disk drive on it? No one? What about a computer with a CD drive? Because mine doesn't have a CD drive on it anymore. And it's interesting in that what you've really got to think about is how you keep information, because if you need it in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, you might not be able to actually access it based on the form or use that it's in. And it's all great having hard copies in a basement somewhere, but if you lose the key, it's the same problem as well. So thankfully, there are some standards out there, like this technical report, 22299, that gives you some recommendations, and they're fairly simple. If you're going to hold images, things like JPEG and PNG are pretty good, which are the ones we normally use. For things like documentation, it talks about things like PDF, OpenOffice, and those sorts of things. So they're the normal files we typically use, but it also has those recommendations of if you want to hold it for 50 years, what format are you going to keep it in? And interestingly, what happens if you have quite data-rich build-in models from architects and engineers? Will that software still be available? Even in the last 10 years that I've been in practice, things like SketchUp has changed owners about 3 or 4 times. There's almost no guarantee that that file will be available in 50 years. And Google is quite good at shutting down things that aren't particularly popular, so there's some risks around those as well. So you've got to think about it. Thankfully, Parker looks and there's some PDFs, but he encounters a problem. He's found these 2 files. He's found Site Final Final and Site Final version 2. And he has a quick look at them, and they're actually very different. The first one appears to have come out of a Blue Peter document of how to build Tracy Island, but is interesting nonetheless, because you can look at this, you can see, wow, I can see Thunderbird 2's hangar is down there, and the bits, but when he opens up Site Final Final, it's got a very different layout. So obviously through the process, the actual layout of the island has changed. And he can't tell, based on these files, which one is the most up-to-date. So there's a problem there, because times are ticking. Does he run off and go the wrong direction and potentially go the wrong way? He needs answers. He needs to know so he can check out this package. Now, sadly, they hadn't used what is one of the things that we have in sort of the BIM standards, which is the robust file naming convention. Which, when you talk about exciting things like this, you wonder why I put silly pictures in my presentations. Now, a fun fact, which I realized fairly recently, according to McKinsey, on average, 19% of a worker's time is spent looking for information. Now, I find that frightening. That's a day a week. People spend clicking through folders looking for things. You see the breakdown on the side there, so you can see this idea of where they're looking. And the idea is this file naming convention, which looks complex, allows you to avoid using folders, having a flat system and searching for things. And the idea is that you break it into fields and can search based on those fields. So broadly speaking, the first bit is you put the project number in. So each project typically has a unique number, so you can find information relevant to that project. The second field is the organization who created that information. So you'd assume if we're looking for an architectural site plan, it would be the architectural team who worked on this project. Functional breakdown is effectively work packages. So you might work out who then was doing the architectural package or the general arrangements. Spatial breakdown can be floor levels, so ground floor, first floor, second floor site. Form is it a drawing, is it a schedule, is it a picture? It gives you that idea of the type of document. Discipline, A for architect, S for structural engineer, that sort of thing. And then there's a number at the end to make the whole thing unique. So in theory, if I wanted to find the ground floor layout to help find where the storage is, I could search for something like 00DA, 00 ground floor, D for drawing, A for architect. And that will look through those thousands of files and immediately come to what I'm looking for. So that's one way we could have helped find it. The other is having extra metadata on there as well. A file name isn't enough. You also need to know whether it's the most up-to-date version or whether it's suitable for what you want to use it for. In these standards, it also talks about this idea of status, where you can actually tag effectively documents and say what they're suitable for. Can I measure off for it? Is it kind of fit for coordination? Can I reference it? Is it suitable for information? Or even at what point is the version that was given over at the end of construction? Which one was accepted at handover? So we can look for A6 to find out which one was actually that final one that was given out effectively as the as-built information. And then at the same time, from a revision point of view, there's always a problem with revisions, and I always quite like this pinwheel drawing, and if you can't read the text at the bottom, it says, out of all the 6 revision Cs, I prefer mine. And there's always a risk in that if you don't have a good document management system, you have these sort of issues. But have a good, robust revision system allow you to work out exactly which one is that latest file. So spending a good 10-15 minutes on this, he works out eventually, right, it is site version 2, and it's that more up-to-date colourful drawing is the one he was after. Brilliant. So from there, he now needs to locate the hangar storage. Zooming in, he seems to find where Thunderbird 2 is. He says, okay, brilliant. I can now go in here and have a look. And expects that actually probably at the back there seems to be some sort of storage unit. So he'll go there and start to investigate what's going on as part of that. The idea is then he goes over, he treks over to find out what's there. And sure enough, he finds the package. And at this point he's going, right, perfect, I've arrived, I want to see if there's any problems here now. He gingerly opens the package, and what does he find inside? He finds some explosives. So, eek. There's a problem there that really shouldn't be there. Although Parker managed to successfully disarm the bomb, save the day, Tracy Island is safe. Can I get a hurrah? Almost. Thank you very much. That's okay. So, interestingly, there's a bit of mop-up to do, because this could happen again in the future. It's not good enough that this was a near miss, it needs to be reported. So, what Parker does is, looking in those same files, he looks for the safety case report. And the idea is that the safety case report is looking at the safety risks, in particular those relating to fire and structural safety, and how they've been assessed and managed. The sort of thing that you might find in a safety case report, basic things like the building's name, some of the relevant people, such as the building safety manager or the person responsible for building safety management if you don't have a dedicated building safety manager, description of the type of the building, a scheduled list of identified and assessed risks, information relevant to fire safety, structural integrity and maintenance, some change management bits, and what to do in the event of emergency. He looks through the list of identified risks, and there's nothing in there about a sabotaged package. So he decides, right, we need to revise it and write his own bit in. So quite simply, he starts then writing in hazard. It's some exploding crates, easy enough. Impact, well, had it gone off, there'd be some serious loss of life or structural damage. Current controls, well, there are none. Action required. He says that you need to implement a process to check crates before you take them off Thunderbird 2. Who should do it? Virgil. And when should he do it? Well, he should have bloody done it yesterday. But at least now, with it updated in the safety case report, people are able to refer to it, and hopefully in the future, there's a new process in place, and this problem will not happen again. After a very long and very stressful day, Parker relaxes with a drink or two and starts to reflect on what happened. And he realizes there are some conclusions that he can draw from this. The first being that, he remembers that because of the Building a Safer Future or the Hackett Review, there are recommendations that there should be this golden thread of information. And yes, Tracy Island had something in place, but it wasn't fully robust. The idea that this golden thread should provide access to key information, like the as-built information and some of the safety case reports and other things, but actually you need a good, robust process in place to make sure that information is accurate, up-to-date and relevant for the activities being undertaken within that building. He recalls the standards such as BS 8644 Part 1 recommend some of the good practices and processes that you could do to enable this golden thread to take place, and that there are some other standards like the ISO 19650 series that actually help support this going forwards. And from there, I think he had a very good night's sleep, had a good rest, and gave Virgil a big kick the following morning. And I think really that takes me to the end of the presentation and open up to any questions you have about Thunderbirds or about the Golden Thread. Thank you very much. Question down the front.
Thank you. ISO 19650, you talked about the way that you could find the information you want based on all those various parameters. My problem is I know the building, I know the name of the building, I know the room I want. I don't know the architect, I don't know the version number, etc., etc. So I didn't see anything in that would help me.
No, that's fine. That's a fair point. And not put in the presentation, the idea is that as part of doing those sorts of projects, there are other documents that are put in place, and those dictate what some of those codes should be. So there's a document called the information standard. There's almost like the manual for what those codes should be on a project, which you could use and refer back to in a way. So the idea is that at the start of the project itself, these things will get defined. And interestingly, even things like, let's say you had HLM architects, just to pick an architectural firm on it, their little code for them, it could be HLM, it could be HLA, it could be HA something else, it could be different every time, so you won't know that for sure. But the idea is this sort of document will sit there and say that anything produced by HLM architects will have the code HLM, anything for the ground floor will be 00, and actually you can refer to that document to do those sorts of picks and searches. And that should form part of the tender documentation and that handover bits and pieces there. I just hadn't included it in the presentation, so apologies for leaving it out, but there are references you can use for that. Thank you. Any other questions?
The simple question is, how would Virgil know what to do? You've got a golden thread, you've got a database, but where's his training in terms of what he does every time he comes off the ship?
No, good question. That was a bit faint for me, so if others didn't hear it, I think the question was, how will Virgil know the training, the competence and everything else there as well? So there's a mix there, and without going too spiely in there, like if there was a good kind of ISO 9000 quality management system, there is that continual improvement element, and because they're trying to set new processes, like checking those crates beforehand, that safety case actually probably should be raised, and they could put it into their standard operating processes where they could do those checks and actually inform those processes is one way it could be done. The other way is that from a building safety point of view, there are several standards that have been put in place now around competence. So there is this point now that actually what we need to do is ensure that the right people have the right skills, knowledge, education and behaviour to be able to do the activities that take place. And there is a competence framework set out for building safety, which actually talks about what a lead designer, a lead contractor, and people who manage building safety need to know from a competency point of view. And people like the RIBA, CIAT, CIBSE, whoever looks after the contractors are starting to build training and registration schemes and others so that you can actually record who is competent to do certain things. And actually you are right, in that situation, maybe Virgil's the pilot. Maybe he isn't the one who should be doing these checks. Maybe someone else should be. But working out who is the right person who is responsible and competent to fulfill their activity is a key part, which is one of the things 8644 talks about in terms of what tasks are relevant to what function people do and ensuring you have those interfaces. But it's a good point that competence is a core requirement. Thank you. Another one over there I can see. Thank you for keeping the Thunderbirds theme in the question as well.
Enjoyable talk. What happens in the case where the as-built information doesn't exist with a lot of existing buildings? So you've got a building safety case and all this coming in, but what happens where there is no information?
Yeah, so very interesting question. So I think I heard most of that, which is what happens if it doesn't exist.
The Act is going to require all of it, so
yeah.
What happens when it doesn't exist?
No, that's fine. So there are two sides to this. We're edging to the edge of my competency on this. So at the same time, if people can correct me, that's also okay, and just let me know. But there are two sides. The first is that, what's happened as of April now is the new gateway process is in place. So anything new going through, and that includes when it goes through refurbishments, change of use, and all those things, will require that information to be there as part of that process. So it could actually mean that there's an upfront element to produce information that didn't exist, even if you're doing something like an extension or a change of use in some parts. But also there have been changes to things like some of the defects and liability kind of statutory instruments, which means actually there'll be some instances now where there are existing buildings where this information actually is needed and might not be available. And people probably have to manage that from a risk appetite point of view, and either they continue as they are, knowing there's actually potentially legal repercussions there, or they might need to employ someone to actually generate and create this information. So, I'm not sponsored by anyone, but you have this idea of people like Matterport can go out and do point clouds and pull up plans for buildings. You have CAD capture. You have, I imagine there'll be people on the stands here that do these sorts of things. I think I saw Plan Radar or someone by there who could help capture documentation and other bits and pieces. So I think the tools will be around to help that, but I think the problem will be that it's managing that risk of, do you risk the problem of turning around in a kind of a legal proceeding and saying, sorry, I didn't think to have that produced or generated, or do you actually go acquire someone to generate and produce that information, which could even be, as people maintain stuff, they start to capture information relevant to that maintenance, and you start to build up that picture of the information that's needed. And hopefully, if it's in occupation, things like risk assessments, I'd expect there to be an asbestos register or some other bits and pieces, a live sort of operational risk assessment, and those things could form the basis of things like that safety case report and some of that other information. Perfect, thank you. At the back.
To continue the theme of the competency of Virgil, where did Parker get the competency to actually carry out the safety case analysis? And also, is there anything in the standard to control who has access to the safety case and can actually amend it or adjust it?
So, again, thank you for keeping the theme into the question. Two parts to that. So yeah, of course, ultimately it could be that Parker is the one given the competency, so there's that delegation and working out who has the right skills. From memory, Parker does have an array of skills from so all sorts of like lock picking and all sorts of things, so actually he could be the right person to do the checks of the inventory. So there is that point. On the access side, when you go through the way that the common data environment works in the standards, it doesn't give you great detail, but it does allow for this ability for access and use. And the way it works with some of the commercial systems out there, things like Viewpoint, Aconex and others, is that you can set some of these kind of criteria on who can access some of that information. And typically you get access to your own work in progress information, and people who have logins have access to shared and published themselves. So in that way, anyone else from International Rescue probably could have access to that information, but if they were starting to build stuff themselves, it would be their own personal drive effectively where they're building it. But you can create those checks and balances, and in fact from a building safety point of view, there could be instances where there's information you might want to give residents, like a fire strategy plan and those sorts of things, but you don't want to give them access to the wealth of detail that comes in some of the other documents. And it's being able to control that through logins, through permissions and other bits. It's perfectly acceptable. A lot of the commercial systems already allow for that sort of thing to happen.